All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Climate Tracker's Caribbean Community Hangout. Today's event is unique for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's our first collaborative event with Climate Analytics Caribbean, and we're very happy to be having this collaboration. We also have three special presentations from three speakers who we know will bring unique and interesting information to us, uncovering and understanding COP from a Caribbean perspective. My name is Dizan Billy. I am the Caribbean Regional Director at Climate Tracker Caribbean. And and basically what we do is Climate Tracker is what it is, a global network of climate reporters and communicators and journalists who, we try to get the perspectives of the global south out there as much as possible. And COP is a big part of what we do as well. This year we have a very healthy team. When I say healthy, it's the biggest Caribbean team we've had reporting at COP, and we're very excited about it. So you'll be meeting two of those fellows today later on in the session. And now that you've gotten to know who I am, I'm also joined by Bianca, who is Bianca. If you're there, if you're available to give an introduction, feel free. If not, that's fine. She can come on a little later and introduce herself as well. So, yeah, let me take the opportunity to welcome each and every one of you. And I know, and I will now hand over to our presenters. So, first of all, the topic on the table for discussion today is covering COP28 from a Caribbean perspective, right? So we're going to hear three different perspectives from our guests, starting with Ruana Haynes, followed by Kalain Hossein, and then Vishani Raghubir. Now, you will be free to ask your questions after each presentation, after each presenter has shared their part. So we're going to start off with Ruana Haynes. I want to get the ball rolling as early as possible. Ruana, so let me give an introduction to Ruana. She is an experienced international climate law and governance specialist and the director of Climate Analytics Caribbean. Ruana has a very strong background in climate and other multilateral environmental negotiations. She's been participating in the UNFCCC for several years on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago and behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, CARICOM. Ruana is deep in it with regards to UNFCCC and COP, right? She has significant experience in international negotiation processes and key importance for small island developing states, including the SDGs, Financing for Development, Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as SIDS Sustainable Development Process. Ruana holds a Master in International Legal Studies from Georgetown University Law Center, Washington, D.C., U.S., and a Master in International Environmental Policy from Sciences Po, Paris, France. So I know that I'm leaving you in very amazingly capable hands. So Ruana, I would like to pass to you to start us off for this session.
Thanks, Dizan. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I have a presentation I would like to share with you. I'm being told I have to check my settings. So maybe give me 1 second. Let me do that. Sorry about that. It seems that I was cut off and trying to change the settings. So let me see if I could share the presentation now. Oh, it's not working. Dizan, would you be able to share my presentation for me, please?
Yes, let me just get it down here.
I'm still going to try again with the settings.
All right, let me share my screen.
Sure. Let me see if this will. No, still no. Ah, okay. Design, I can actually share. I just need to refresh the page.
All right, great. Okay.
So it means I might fall off and come back.
Okay, while we get that ready, please feel free to drop in the chat where you're from, where you're joining us from, and maybe what you do, just to get things going in terms of getting to know each other a little bit, because we have quite a diverse registration list, which we are really interested in. Ruana, I see you're speaking, but I can't hear you. I can share my screen if that helps.
Design, you can go ahead because it's not
All
working for
right.
me.
Okay, no problem. So let me share my screen and it should be there now. There we go.
Great. Can you go into presenter mode for the. All right, great. I see people are introducing themselves in the chat. It seems like we have a very broad audience. I'll try to keep my remarks at a very high level, but still give enough details so that you have a good idea of what's expected from this COP in relation to the issue of the global stocktake, which is a major outcome expected this year. So next slide, please. In terms of the outline for my presentation, I want to touch on 5 main baskets of issues. Briefly look at some of the key design features of the Paris Agreement, which are highly relevant for the discussions that we'll be having on the GST at this COP. Give you guys an idea of what the global stocktake actually is, perhaps the most unsexy acronym that exists within the climate process. We'll talk a little bit about how the global stocktake process has been conducted, and we will look at what the priorities of CARICOM, what are the priorities of CARICOM for the GST as recently set out in a CARICOM ministerial statement that was delivered yesterday. And then finally, we're going to have a look at where we are now and specifically what is expected on the GST at COP28. So I have a quote here to just give sort of a very high level flavor from the president designate, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, where he says that this COP must be a historic turning point in this critical decade for parties to seize the moment of the global stocktake, to raise their ambition, to unite, act, and deliver, to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal within reach while leaving no one behind. Next slide, please. So this is animated, so you're just going to have to click for me. So we're looking at some of the key design features, continue clicking, of the Paris Agreement that were important for small island developing states as well as least developed countries and many groups of countries going into those negotiations in 2015. So the fact that there are legally binding aspects of the agreement is key and was key in those discussions. Before the Paris Agreement existed, we were in more of a bottom-up world where we had the Kyoto Protocol in place, but the Kyoto Protocol only included specific commitments for a very small group of countries that were considered developed countries at the time. So it was really important to go into the Paris Agreement with an understanding that we want to have a legally binding agreement in place that would apply to all parties. There are still countries that will debate whether or not the Paris Agreement as a whole is a legally binding treaty, but it is very clear that there are specific legally binding commitments that are included in the agreement. So, and around those commitments, we needed to have a certain level of certainty in relation, for example, to the obligation to submit a nationally determined contribution, to maintain that nationally determined contribution, and to update that nationally determined contribution, which sets out really the core of the legally binding nature of the Paris Agreement, because nationally determined contributions contain the actions that parties want to take in order to comply with, in order to be able to attain the goals that are set out in that agreement. So we have some others around measurability, and that goes to the idea of specificity. It goes to the idea of being able to um, transparently understand the actions that parties have submitted, and this is contained in the context of the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, universal application that I spoke to, a separate article dealing with loss and damage. Loss and damage was not included anywhere in the original convention or in the Kyoto Protocol. Compliance arrangements were also key, as well as an inclusion of the consideration of the special circumstances of SITs. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on this issue of the ambition or ratchet up mechanism and what that means in the context of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So this links directly into the GST. And I have a quote here from the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC describing the GST as a tool which was to result in a roadmap, and giving some elements of what should be included in this roadmap pertaining to sector by sector and region by region, actor by actor guidance for the interventions that are needed in order to align with a resilient 1.5 degrees Celsius world, as well as the need for this roadmap to speak to further action and where that action might be required in a practical and usable way. The mandate for the GST is contained in Article 14. There are 3 key elements. The first is that it is a collective assessment that is thematically looking at the issues of mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, and support in the light of equity and the best available science. The second is that the first global stocktake will take place in 2023, and this is the global stocktake that we're in right now, which will conclude at this COP, and it will take place every 5 years. And the third key element of the mandate is that the GST outcome is meant to inform parties in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their actions and support, as well as in enhancing international cooperation for climate action. Next slide, please. So this is a bit on the process that has been outlined, and I don't want to spend too long on this slide. The key things to understand here is that we've been in a 2-year-long process that started in 2021 and that is concluding this year, and that there are 3 phases to that process: an information collection and preparation phase, a technical assessment phase, as well as a consideration of outputs phase. We are now in the consideration of outputs phase. You might note that it's the phase that has been allocated the least amount of time. Maybe it wasn't the most practical choice to organize it in this way. We are rushing to the finish line to try to design political messages, to try to conclude the discussion on the roadmap that the Executive Secretary spoke of in order to come out with a robust outcome from this first GST. Next slide, please. And so how does the GST process equal an ambition mechanism of the Paris Agreement? So the idea is, and we started in 2018 with kind of a warm-up for the GST with a Talanoa dialogue that was supposed to result in delivery of new and updated NDCs in 2020. And from that basis, we head into the first GST concluding this year, which is supposed to result in new and enhanced updated NDCs in 2025. On the 5-year cycle, the next GST will begin in 2026 and conclude in 2028, and so on and so on, and result in revised NDCs in 2030. So the idea is every 5 years, there's an opportunity to conduct this collective assessment an opportunity to take stock of where we are, what are the successes, what are the gaps, what are the lessons learned, um, what are the lessons learned, what are the tools that we need in order to improve our climate action in relation to the specific goals that are set out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Could you click for me, Dazan? Thanks. So, however, we do not have successive 5-year GST cycles in order to course correct. We know from the IPCC that according to the model mitigation pathways that they have designed, in order to have more than a 50% chance of limiting warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius, with no or limited overshoot, or even to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we have to assume immediate action that implies deep global greenhouse gas emissions reductions in this decade. So that means in order to have a fighting chance of staying within warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we actually need action within this decade out to 2030. It means that this GST is perhaps the only GST that matters for keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal on the table. It means that the next GST can help us to accelerate action. But if we miss the mark at this COP, we might as well kiss that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit goodbye. And that, of course, coming from the regions that are represented in this group, we know that this is a huge problem. Next slide, please. And so what have CARICOM ministers said about their expectations for the GST process? They've indicated that this GST must deliver on 4 key headline commitments. The pursuit of 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways for just, equitable, and accelerated transition. And this includes everything from setting targets for renewable energy, global targets on renewable energy and energy efficiency, calling for advanced economies to immediately phase out of fossil fuels. They've also called to accelerate progress and implementation on the global goal on adaptation. This will also be agreed at this COP. And there are agreed sectoral priority areas that have been put forward for adaptation by the Alliance of Small Island States that have been endorsed. Food, health, water are some of these. They've called for the GST outcome to ensure that we can operationalize and capitalize the loss and damage fund. So they want to ensure that we see a call for early capitalization of the loss and damage fund, for funding from all sources to be directed in that area. And they've also called for the delivery of transformational finance for 1.5 degrees Celsius agenda. And this includes everything from ensuring that there are investments flowing to small island developing states for their own transitions, as well as importantly for adaptation, because adaptation finance is lagging behind and we continue to experience the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So where are we now? So according to the IPCC, we know that every increment of warming will result in regional changes in, could you go back? Thank you. In mean climate and extremes, and that those changes will become more widespread and pronounced. And I don't want to stay too long on this slide, but this is a graphic representation of what these temperature limits mean. It may sound as if there's no real difference between a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit and a 2 degrees Celsius limit, but there is an extreme difference. At every 10th of degree of warming, we will be exposed to more and more risks in relation to heat, in relation to desertification, in relation to precipitation, and linked to flooding, linked to extreme events. So this GST will be consequential, extremely consequential, for the regional changes in mean and climate extremes that we are likely to experience in the future. And even if we miss the mark because there are those who are saying, well, we have more time. If we have an overshoot of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that lands us in a 2+ degree world, you can see here the types of impacts that we will be exposed to in that context. So an overshoot has implications for loss and damage. It has implications for the extent to which vulnerable countries, the extent to which we have livable societies and viable economies, even on the premise that we may come back down later on. And so, in terms of the actual process, we've completed the technical phase, the political phase is underway, but this question of actually being able to follow up on the GST outcome hangs in the balance. And in order to be able to ensure that we can have a consequential GST that keeps the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in reach, what we need to see is a clear follow up to this year's conclusion of the GST process. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. You can continue clicking this on. So obviously the expectations are high for an outcome that would be robust. But at this point, there is almost no agreement on any of the key issues under discussion. So this is just to give a flavor of what some of those issues are. On informing NDCs, parties are discussing calling for enhanced NDCs, a post-GST follow-up process, and a capacity building program to help countries to design their NDCs. On mitigation, a goal to triple renewable energy output and double energy efficiency, as well as a commitment to some type of fossil fuel phase out, is being discussed. On adaptation, parties are discussing high-level targets for implementing a global goal on adaptation. On loss and damage, the Alliance of Small Island States has called for the development of indicators for being able to measure loss and damage, and this is to be able to support countries to access funding from the Loss and Damage Fund once it is capitalized. And then finally, on finance and means of implementation, there is a bit of a back and forth discussion happening there on the relationship between the provision of finance and aligning financial flows with a low carbon development pathway. So there's a discussion on the reform of international financial institutions, as well as a discussion on how to follow up on promises that were made to double adaptation finance. So this is just a flavor of the range of issues that are going to be coming forward in a GST discussion at this COP. But as I said, there is precious little agreement on any of them, and time is limited. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Rowana. And hello, everyone. I'm Bianca Bedu. I'm the communications lead at Climate Analytics Caribbean. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Zan and the Climate Tracker team for teaming up with us on this. Ru, I have a question for you. So we know that the global stocktake is referred to as the ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. We need to be empowered to transform ambition into action. How do you think communities in the Caribbean can get better involved in the GST process? What are some actionable ways communities and individuals can really drive ambition into action?
I think there will be a lot of opportunities for that with the conclusion of this GST, but that also depends on how robust this GST outcome is and the extent to which there is an appropriate follow-up process agreed and in place. So the idea is that the GST outcome must inform party actions, whether it be on mitigation, adaptation, provision of finance. What that means is that we expect all countries, after the conclusion of this GST, to be involved in basically renewing their climate plans, renewing all of their actions across the board to ensure that it is in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. This creates opportunities for civil society engagement with their governments as they're in this process to update their NDCs onto the global goal on adaptation. It should create opportunities for a high level of consultation with civil society where it would be very useful for people to be involved in crafting the government's response to the outcome of the GST along all of these indicators. So I think there will be opportunities, but we're not sure exactly yet what the actual follow-up process at the global level is going to look like.
Excellent. Ru, thank you again for another enlightening session. As usual, we love to hear your insights. And if anyone has any questions, we will have hopefully some time afterwards, so you can ruminate on your questions for Ru. But in the interest of time, let's jump right in. Colleen, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, great. So Colleen, I'm very, very excited. I think Dizan will give you a proper introduction, but we're really excited to have you because, of course, you are an ambassador for Climate Analytics Caribbean for actually the Global Stocktake campaign that we've been trying to drive forward in the Caribbean, and you've been amazing. And you are this year a Climate Tracker Fellow. So take it away, Dizan.
Thank you so much. So as we get ready to hear from Colleen, now Colleen is going to share with us some of his COP27 experiences, lessons learned, and some key stories going into COP28. So an introduction to Colleen, he is an award-winning multimedia journalist based in Trinidad and Tobago. Since 2014, he's been reporting on weather, climate, and environment for his online media company, Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center. In 2019, Colleen joined Guardian Media Limited in Trinidad and Tobago as their weather anchor, producing compelling weather, climate, and environmental coverage across television, print, digital, and radio. He has also led the Guardian Media's coverage through inclement weather events like tropical cyclones and floods, as well as international climate conferences such as the 2022 UN COP27 that happened in Egypt. Colleen has a deep interest in climate change and nature conservation journalism, as well as in using data in explanatory reports to link the weather that we experience, to long-term trends of our now changing climate. So, Colleen, I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to head straight over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dizan, and good morning, everybody. Let me try to get this shared. All right. Cool. You all seeing the presentation? Just need a confirmation.
Yes.
Right. Okay, cool. All right, great. So let me get that set up and jump right into it. Okay, so my name's Ghislaine Hussein. I'm a journalist. Last year, I was selected as an Earth Journalism Fellow to attend COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And it was honestly a pretty amazing experience. Now, this was the first time I've traveled to that part of the world. It was my first time at any major international conference. So as somebody from the Caribbean, you know, we are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change. And especially last year, November, I left Trinidad when it was flooding quite a bit. And throughout the entire 2.5-week, 3-week period, while we were all at COP, we had a tropical storm hit the Bahamas. We had tropical storms hit parts of the Leewards. We had significant floods for the entirety of COP, but it was happening in Trinidad. So we were seeing the impacts happen on our soils while we were high and dry in Egypt, but still trying to negotiate. At least our negotiators were still trying to negotiate, stuff to essentially mitigate what we're already experiencing. So it was an eye-opening experience for sure. And let me jump right into my presentation. It shouldn't be too long. So for me, this was probably one of the longest hauls I did to travel from Trinidad and Tobago to Egypt. Now, you know, interregional travel in is a nightmare. You essentially have to kill the planet to move somewhere else. Last year, it was a trip from Trinidad to London to Turkey to Sharm el-Sheikh. This year, it's looking to be a similar 2-day trip from Trinidad to Panama, Amsterdam, then Dubai. Now, throughout this entire presentation, I'll also tell you some of the lessons I learned or some of the strategies I utilized as a journalist to ensure my COP27 experience was successful, and I'll also be replicating that for COP28. So last year, I had a 24-hour layover in London before COP. Now, we are 2 weeks away from COP as of today. So what I used my layover to do was really finalize my schedule. Now, COP has hundreds, if not thousands, of side events happening during that 2 week period. And it can be very overwhelming if you don't go through that side event list and schedule and select explicitly what you want to do. And it takes some time. It took me about 2 or 3 hours to go through all of the side events, look at the titles, look at the presenters, look at what they were speaking about, and essentially plan these are the things I want to cover based on the themes of COP that I wanted to cover last year. And we'll get a little bit on that later, but use your layovers to your advantage. Now, COP is an extremely chaotic event. Anybody who's been to any moving through this very large compound in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, trying to figure out where the buildings were, where the rooms were, that we would potentially be speaking at or predominantly based at, and looking at where certain areas were. So when events are happening, we can get there quite quickly. And Sharm el Sheikh was my first COP, so I can't compare it to other COPs, but for me, first couple of days, we got like the true desert experience. There was a shortage of food. There was a shortage of water. We had sandwiches that, would be sold in Starbucks in Trinidad for about like $30-$40. We were paying 20 US for those same sandwiches during that food and water shortage. Thankfully, it was rectified by day 3, but it was a proper struggle bus for the first 2 days. So, after learning the lay of the land, find out where food, water, and restrooms are. As a journalist who will be very, very busy during COP, running around, getting interviews, going to side events, coming back to the media hub to write your stories, that's very important. And also probably walk with a lot of snacks because the lines, especially around lunchtime, will be very, very long. Now, something else that happened last year was that we were still very much in the throes of the pandemic, even though we were sort of turning a blind eye to it. And this is a conference that had over 40,000 people in a relatively large venue, but 40,000 people in a small area is still going to cause some problems, whether it be influenza or, in our case, COVID-19. And COVID-19 by the end of week 1 was spreading like wildfire across COP. Now this year, COVID is still there, but we also have other viruses that will be spreading. So, lots of crowd, yeah, lots of COVID-19, and, you want to play it safe, wear your mask if you can, take your vitamin C, take your supplements, and your health is really your wealth at these conferences. So this is my experience, may not be everybody else's, but, you want to put yourself first as well during this reporting experience and your time at COP now and COP28 this year. So I didn't just report, and I was very thankful and blessed to have multiple experiences at COP outside of just reporting on the day-to-day and my stories. I was offered the opportunity to moderate some high-level discussions and interact with prime ministers and presidents and lead negotiators from other small island developing states and other countries, participated on some panels in the Children and Youth Pavilion. And also we had 1 day of rest. So carving out some space in there to do an activity that you would like to do in Egypt, in Sharm el Sheikh. Sharm el Sheikh is known for diving, and I'm a diver. So I definitely went out into the Red Sea and did some diving, and you can see that on the picture ahead. Now, you'll also see 2 pictures on the bottom left of the screen. I had a very difficult time turning off from work. So even though I would go out for dinner, you would see me and one of my friends, Zoha, there. We would always be on our phones or always be on our laptops, tracking the negotiations in case we need to write a story that is breaking. And at COP27, we had a lot of late night decisions because if any of you have interacted with your negotiators before, you would know that sometimes these discussions go on until like 2-3 in the morning. They would go get like 2-3 hours sleep and then back at it in the morning. So you'd want to be tracking all of this that is coming out of COP pretty much 24/7. But again, your health is your wealth. So don't burn yourself out, especially during that first week. So now on to the actual reporting and how did I manage that? So I am a planner and I took quite a lot of time researching what is COP, how to report at COP, and thankfully at Earth Journalism Network, and even this year at Climate Tracker, they have a lot of presentations and people who have went to multiple COPs and gave their experiences and help you prepare and essentially research ahead of time so that your experience can be the most beneficial and most productive. So about 2 months before, I looked at the key issues last year, and I did the same thing this year. Thankfully, I reported last year, so I already knew some of the issues that going into COP, these are the areas that I wanted to focus on. I found my subject matter experts, or at least tried to find many of them as possible, and set my objectives of what I wanted to accomplish at COP this year. Now, 1 month out, began interviewing some of the key players and looked at the priorities heading into COP to acquire context for upcoming negotiations. And when you start to write these stories as well, those interviews will definitely give you the context that is needed to write the best story. And 1 month out, I already started my schedule because again, this year I'll have speaking engagements, moderating events, also trying to balance my own reporting. So you don't want to say yes to everything and then end up at COP and not being able to fulfill your basic assignment, which is reporting on the event, right? 2 weeks out. Now, today is 2 weeks out from the official opening of COP. COP begins officially on November 29th. So today, touch base with everybody in my editorial team, which I did actually last week, to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You want to have your deliverables quite clear, so that way when you get to COP, you're not dilly-dallying at the same time, but you're not also burning yourself out by overproducing content that is not necessarily used for your primetime news or your newspaper. And it is a bit disheartening if you do end up producing a significant amount of content and it's never used. So you want to set realistic goals. And for that, I created a content plan last year, and I did the same this year. So that content plan looked at everything from what pieces. I work in multimedia, as Dizan would have said in my bio, across TV, print, digital, radio. So I would look at what pieces I need to produce for which platforms and what content I need to capture in order for those pieces to be successful on those platforms. So that means coming up with short lists, coming up with storyboards for ideas. And really, this content plan will also be a little bit fluid depending on the days and the interviews that I managed to get while I'm at COP28. It was quite fluid as well when I was at COP27, but once I have a clear target of what I wanted to accomplish every day, I was able to execute. So 1 week out, that would be next week, Wednesday. So that is where our curtain raisers at GML will start to be published, where, I will write about the issues, or have already written about the issues that I will be covering and looking at the historical context of those issues. So for example, some of the things I'll be tracking, as well as many of you, the journalists that are on here, will be looking at loss and damage, global stocktake. For me, I took a keen interest in the early warnings for all initiative because it's meteorology. I work in the meteorological field every day. So that was something I tracked quite closely last year. Now you should, at this point, a week out, begin have a near final draft of the events, conferences, the schedule, the plenaries, all that stuff. So you know exactly who you're targeting, where you're targeting as well. And this is where you can also begin pre-writing stories if you for the actual COP. So last year, that 24-hour layover I had in London, I was already pre-writing stories on the electricity rates and energy transitions and other islands in the Caribbean. And when I got my interviews on week 2 of COP, it was just for me to insert where I actually had that interviews, their sound bites or their quotes, and just hit publish. At COP27, all of the other 20 journalists who were there, they were all very, very, like in Trinidad, we say spinning top in mud, where they were very flustered towards the end of the day. And I was just like, because my work was done. I did a lot of pre-planning so that my COP experience was pretty smooth, even with the chaos that was unfolding in Trinidad, because I also have reporting responsibilities for any issues that popped up weather-wise in Trinidad and Tobago, even while I'm in, well, at that point, Sharm el Sheikh, in this case would be Dubai. So Pre-COP. Now we're coming up to the days leading up to COP. So I get to Dubai on the 27th. Last day I also got there about 2 or 3 days before COP actually began. So you want to have a final sketch schedule for all of the COP events, continue executing whatever your content plan is, and whatever you think you can write or pre-write about or plan, do it, because planning is key for having a smooth COP. And COP is also one of those things that, again, chaotic. So you need to roll with the punches sometimes because not every day is going to be the same. So your week one is going to be it was extremely busy for me. We had a lot of side events going on, and these were either panels that I attended, spoke at, moderated. You also have stuff going on at the high level discussions with the plenary and negotiations that you have a lot of scientific reports that are dropped on that first week as well. And it's a lot to synthesize, for you to digest and then for you to report on. So it's a lot of reading that happens. So you want to execute your content plan. For me, my advice is don't spend too much time chasing the high profile figures like the Mia Motleys of the region and the world, because I understand that, we would want to get the best soundbite and all that stuff, but also they are cognizant that they want to get outlet that has the biggest reach. So they may not want to come to CNC3 when they could go to a CNN. So, don't spend too much time. Still try to send your request out to interview whoever you want to interview, but don't spend your entire COP experience running down these big fish, for example. You'll find a lot of stories from other business CEOs, NGOs, individuals, climate activists, even your own peers who are there. It's a good idea to, interview them, find out why they're here, why this is important, because those are really good offbeat stories as well. And you want to, adapt and prioritize and utilize your resources that are available to you, as well as your team back home if you're reporting to a larger media house and you have an available team back home. So there are some aspects of my coverage this year that even though I'll be in Dubai and getting the videos or recording the interviews, I may not be the one that will be explicitly writing up some of these interviews, because I can always send it back home and have someone from my team write it up as well. And that divide and conquer, because you don't want to burn yourself out as well. Communicate with your editorial teams, really paramount, so that way you ensure that your content's being used. And utilize your resources, because last year I used Otter to transcribe all of my interviews, and literally and I was doing this for the team that I was working at the Journalism Network, because we did a lot of group interviews. So within about 30 minutes after an interview, I already had Otter transcribe the entire interview, exported as a PDF, sent it to everybody. The video file was already uploaded to a shared drive. So it was very efficient. Everybody had access to all of that as well. So use the team that you have as well, regardless of your fellowship with Climate Tracker this year, but other fellowships could take you there as well. So use that team and leverage it well. Week 2, this is where you're going to start to feel the burn, because you would have put all your energy into week 1, and week 2, you will start to feel tired. So again, prioritize your sleep, prioritize eating on time and actually eating good meals. Continue executing that content plan that you would have created, tracking negotiations, and utilize your quiet periods for interviews. And post-COP, well, you still have a content plan that you're supposed to execute. So continue doing that. For me last year, after COP, I came back to Trinidad and had to work on, an hour-long documentary. And thankfully, not thankfully, but I put a lot of work into my coverage at COP and my coverage after COP. And I was the recipient of 5 awards at the Caribbean Broadcasting Union. 4 of those came from my work on covering climate change. 1 of those came from my work on covering COVID. So, this, even though it was my first COP, I think I was pretty successful in my plan and executing that plan. And also post-COP, you want to look at data analysis and fact-checking, look at outlines for your multimedia pieces to ensure that you have, everything that you need to execute that post-COP content plan. And also you may want to follow up with your pre-COP interviewees to see if they are pleased with what came out of COP28. I did that with COP27, and that was also a pretty good interview as well. So wrapping up now, because cognizant of time. So what stories should you be following? Well, you can follow, there's so much going on at COP. You can follow anything you really want. These are just some of the major talking points that you will see. at any COP. This year, we're looking at the GST and national commitments, as Rihanna mentioned and went into quite in depth in her presentation about. Also look at the energy transition, look at any renewable projects, any energy project coming out of your area, adaptation and resilience funding and strategies, what countries are doing it better than your country and how can we learn from them. You can also look at, climate finance. We are looking at loss and damage. That's a big talking point as well this year, talking about anything from the biodiversity crisis as well. How can we look at nature-based solutions to help combat climate change, looking at carbon markets and different new initiatives like blue carbon and the green hydrogen industry and all of these new frontiers of technology. And I mentioned that after climate justice as well. That's a very important point. And I know Climate Tracker has a specific focus on that. Looking at what other companies, not just oil and gas companies, but other multinational and international companies are doing as part of their CSR responsibilities and their commitments. Are they meeting those commitments and what else are they being put forth at COP28? Look at your local climate initiatives, NGOs at COP28, oceans and climate, how does that link and what is being done to protect our oceans? COPs have a lot of protests as well. And sometimes you get really good stories out of those. So looking at what these people are protesting for, why are they protesting, their stories as well. It's really good stories to have the people element at COP. And obviously the negotiations, because that's what's happening at COP. That's the main event. So you want to be tracking that as well. That'll primarily pick up during that second week. So I will end there. I hope to see a lot of you in Dubai. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colleen, for your presentation. And I love the way that you really went through week by week and the content plan and everything. Now, I always tell people who are reporting on COP for the first time, it's so important to kind of manage your expectations and manage your preparations as well, because when you get on the ground, it's only when you reach there that you realize how massive this thing really is. So I love the approach that you've taken, Colleen, last year, and I know that you're going to do some great things this year as well. I think I have a question, and then I'm going to go over to Bianca as well. Bringing it back to the Caribbean perspective a little bit. As a reporter last year at COP27, I think, what is the key, one thing that you can share with another Caribbean reporter or media personnel who is looking to have and spotlight Caribbean voices and the Caribbean story? How would you, or what would be your number one advice for that person?
Last year at COP27, there was a 5 Seas pavilion that essentially all of the CARICOM individuals was at the entire time. If you need to get a Caribbean perspective, a Caribbean person's perspective, just hang around there. All you need to do is just stay there. You would see prime ministers or presidents or heads of state, negotiators. That's where you should go to. I think this year, I know AOSIS also has a pavilion. So if you want to get other small SIDS, other small island developing states perspective, go to the pavilions where you will get those voices. And a lot of people, I don't think there was a single person I asked at COP for an interview that turned me down. And go in there, be really nice to them, and generally they'll be nice to you back. But if you want to get specifically a Caribbean perspective, look for where the Caribbean voices are.
For sure, and it also helps. CARICOM pavilion is usually the one with the most vibes. Just gonna put that out there. Bianca, I think you have a question as well.
I do. Colleen, I actually have 2 questions, and I am cognizant of the time, but it's important that we ground this also in the GST. With regard to the global stocktake specifically, how can journalists in the Caribbean frame stories for a regional audience to really understand how critical the process is to our region? And then when you're done with that, I have one more question.
Yeah, so looking at the GST is one of those things that it's scientific and it could go over a lot of people's heads. So you want to link what essentially the GST is trying to accomplish to the impacts that people are already feeling. Because at the end of the day, people watch our stories and try to get what they try to get from it is, how does this affect me? How does this affect the price of bread? How will this affect my water supply? How will this affect the price of electricity? So when the global stocktake and the synthesis report and everything is released, and we also explain what our NDCs are. As journalists, we need to link what our NDCs are and how that affects not only our country when it comes to making a transition, but also how does it impact the globe, and how the impact of a warmer world and what the ramifications are for an increasingly warmer world will be on you. And that should be able to drive the point home of global stocktake, is a process for us to stop that warmer world future from happening.
Thanks so much. And very quickly, last year, what were any significant moments or developments that you witnessed specifically with regard to Caribbean negotiators?
So I actually had a lot of offbeat interviews with stuff that I wasn't even planning on having. So I did interview with two business CEOs. One of them signed an MOU with the Antigua and Barbuda government for a blue carbon initiative. And that one actually won an award at the Caribbean Broadcasting Union. When it comes to the negotiators, though, trying to pin down your negotiators is really important, because they are also very, very busy. So, following from Trinidad and Tobago's perspective, we have to follow up with Kishan Kumar Singh, who is really a rock star at all of these COPs. But making sure that you touch base with them every day to find out what the different negotiations are. And for me, it was getting the behind the scenes look at what was happening in the loss and damage talks. That was probably my standout moment of hearing essentially the bacchanal that was going on with like these random Scandinavian countries being like, never mind, we don't want loss and damage, completely out of the blue, and everyone was shocked.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Colleen. Back to you, Dazan.
Thank you so much, Colleen. So I'm going to go now to our third presenter, Vishani Raghubir. Vishani, you can feel free to put on your video. Vishani is a 23-year-old journalist in Guyana who currently reports for the Newsroom Incorporated. She's also part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Journalism Fellowship with Climate Tracker. Vishani has a keen interest in science journalism and data visualization. She recently won the Caribbean Broadcast Union's Television Award for the advancement of media and information literacy. She also won awards for the Guyana Press Association and the Pan American Health Organization, World Health Organization. Vishani, welcome, and I'm going to go straight across to you.
Thank you, Dizan. Hello, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here with you all, and also very grateful to hear, I guess, some of the rigors of dealing with COP from Colleen, because in a few weeks, this will be my first time going to COP. I'll just share my screen now with you folks. All right, just confirming that everyone can see my screen.
Not yet.
What about now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Colleen spoke a bit about story ideas heading into COP. And I think it's really great that I'm coming after him talking about COP and what story ideas you can look out for. I'm going to head a little bit more specifically into the global stocktake. Not because it's more important than anything Colleen has said or anything of the sort, just because it's a huge focus this year for reasons that you've heard from the speakers before me. So this is just a general sense of what stories we should look out for and go after. And after I was reviewing my slides, I realized I should probably put a quick disclaimer out there. This is not in any way like an exhaustive or prescriptive list for any of my colleagues. You folks understand your country realities much better than I do. You folks are professionals. You know your work. But these are just some thoughts that I have that I think might be valuable to share with you all. So I sort of frame this around a lot of questions. As journalists, we ask a lot of questions, and questions help us think through. So like Colleen mentioned, a huge part of preparing for COP is planning. And for me, planning is figuring out what questions I want answered at COP, or even before COP, after COP, just figuring out what are the answers I'm looking for, what are the answers that people in Guyana, because I am from Guyana, I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier on, But what things are people in Ghana or people in the Caribbean interested in? And when we think about the global stocktake and what we know about the global stocktake, I think there are three very critical things that stand out for me personally. And that would be where are countries now, what actions are needed, and what does action and inaction mean for us? So we heard already the GST rests upon what progress we're making towards our climate goals, and for some, what progress we aren't making. And I'll share a funny story with you. I asked my vice president last week at a press conference about his take on the GST, and he gave a very cynical answer. He said, essentially, not in these exact words, that he doesn't really care about the GST because he already knows that we aren't making the progress we need to make and we aren't getting the money that we need to get. So hearing that and now having to think about the GST, heading to COP and covering the GST makes me wonder, really and truly, how do I cover the GST and how do I cover COP in a way that just not in a way that doesn't promote that sort of cynicism, I guess, like in a way that helps people to care about what's going on instead of just writing it off as something that we shouldn't pay attention to and we shouldn't care about. The first thing I think that's important is to recognize, appreciate, identify what are our individual climate goals. So for Ghana, we're hoping to achieve net zero by 2050. And for those of you who know a little bit about what's going on in Ghana, we're a unique case. We're trying to get to net zero by 2050 by balancing oil and gas production or new oil and gas production with our long-standing forest conservation, and also infusing new forms of renewable energy, all parts of a plan called the Low Carbon Development Strategy that is meant to sort of propel our sustainable development. I've written a few stories on that sort of balancing act Ghana is hoping to achieve. And we're still in that phase where we're trying to figure out whether or not it's actually possible, but also whether or not Ghana sort of has a right to do that. And even if it has a right to do that, what are some of the implications of pursuing things this route? Similarly, for other countries, there are very unique stories coming out of our own realities. What's happening in Trinidad and Tobago that has been an oil producer for so long, and now it looks towards a sustainable future. So I would focus on what's happening in our countries, just at the basic level, just figuring out what's happening in your countries and what are your individual climate goals. I mentioned how Ghana is trying to achieve its sort of low carbon sustainable pathway. What does that look like in other countries? And how are the discussions and negotiations that are happening at COP going to affect those, if at all? But also, because we're from the Caribbean, a space that's increasingly vulnerable to climate change, and a space that is has historically faced limited resources, what are the constraints that we're grappling with? We hear a lot about our financial constraints, the lack of technology that we have here. So how are we really grappling with those challenges? And how do those challenges impact the goals that we set out for ourselves? Do those challenges mean that those goals are just things on paper, or are they achievable? What do those mean? So I think that leads to what actions are needed. And aside from the GST, I think something that a lot of us will be looking forward to this year, at least I certainly am, following what happened last year at COP27, is the loss and damage fund. Obviously, I think it's well ventilated by now that we need money, we need lots of it. But money is not the only thing, I think. I think we also need to focus on some of our policies in some of our countries. So again, relating things back to Ghana's LCDS and its balancing act, do we need better policies, or is this policy good enough? What are some of the concerns about the policies? Is there support for those policies? Do we also need more political will? I think those of us in our region know that our leaders seem serious about climate action, but they constantly say we're constrained by our resources. But do we need more political will? Do we need more advocacy in terms of pushing for those things that will help us achieve our goals? And it's not just about the governments alone, it's also about other stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, or activists, those who are there, also talking about all that needs to happen and whether or not those things are happening. So I just put some considerations here also in terms of what actions are needed. For me, one of the things I will be focusing on a lot at COP28, or one of the things I hope to focus a lot on at COP28, is climate financing. On one hand, loss and damage, yes, but coming from Ghana, which is now venturing into the carbon credit scene, looking at more support for forests. Last year at COP27, two or three of the side events that involved Ghana focused on increased monetary support for preserving our forests, and those came from the European Union, the European Commission, sorry. Also figuring out other ways of responding to what are our needs. So I remember, I believe it was Kalain, and he spoke about this, about writing a story on technology. I think it was his story with Antigua and Barbuda that he mentioned that won the award. So things like that are cool to look out for. And finally, the last thing that I think is a broad heading that's important to think about is what does action and inaction mean for us? I didn't put it here, and in retrospect, I probably should have, but I think, again, because of where we come from, because of the realities our country face, because of the challenges our countries face, at the core of everything we report, more or less, is sort of a climate justice focus. We have stark realities we're grappling with. We are small, vulnerable countries, states, islands, whether it is we're battered by hurricanes, or in my case, increasing floods. Some of us have to grapple with unreliable energy supplies, and we're now trying to transition to more reliable energy supplies, and reliable energy supplies, in some cases, using renewable energy sources, in some cases, expanding non-renewable energy sources. In Ghana, we are now trying to set up a gas to energy project, and that should come on stream next year, which is essentially using natural gas as being produced offshore. So what really happens for us when we don't get action, or when we don't do the things we set out to do in our climate goals? What does that mean? Do we not have proper electricity to deal with? Do we continue grappling with flooding that wipes out people's livelihoods and so forth? But then on the flip side, because I mean, it's not all doom and gloom, and I don't want to sound like my vice president, you know, we can expect some good things to happen. We hope for good things to happen. So given that we are going to get this global stocktake, and we already know some of what it says, is this really going to be a moment in time when our countries, or countries generally, or stakeholders generally, will intensify their advocacy and will intensify their support? And how will that better support what happens in our own countries? How will that help to transform the lives of people in Guyana and Trinidad, across the region? And how does that also help to transform our economies? Because at the end of the day, economic growth, whether we like it or not, is a huge focus of our countries. So these are just some of these stories that were already published that I thought was cool to mention. There's a familiar face over there for anyone who recognizes him. So some of the folks, there was an event from Climate Analytics, the folks joining us here today, talking about the global stocktake, and they've been talking about it for a while now, even though, for example, in Ghana, some of us are now starting to pick up on the GST ahead of, as we inch closer to COP28. They've been talking about it for a while. I think it's really good to get expert opinions and an expert take on this really scientific sort of thing that's going to happen at COP. But it's also important for me, a huge thing for me, is to sort of explain and break down why the GST is an important consideration. And I put this screenshot here from Reuters, because what Reuters did was an explainer on what is the global stocktake on climate change. Dizan mentioned my award from the CBU. I got that award because I did an explainer on the carbon credits venture. Last year, December, this was the first time so many of us, even us in the media, we heard about, you know, this whole carbon credits deal and the R3's mechanism and jurisdictional accreditation and a bunch of stuff that was just above our heads at the time. So it was really important for me to sort of take that and break it down in a way that the average Joe could understand what was happening, as a way of inviting people into the conversation. I'm not just going to COP to report on COP and on climate because it looks good on my CV. I'm going there, and we're all going there because we think these are important stories that need to be told. But while we think these are important stories that need to be told, we have a very crucial responsibility of making sure that or people understand sort of what's going on. So I think explainers are great. So it's not just about what to think about when you're reporting on the GST or reporting about COP, but it's also how you report. This Reuters explainer is obviously something that's a bit more global. So for me, one of my plans, one of my pre-COP stories is to sort of take COP28, take the GST, and break it down in a way that relates it to what's happening to the bread and butter here in Ghana. And Kalain mentioned that just now when he was answering the question posed to him. You know, how do you get people to care about this? You take it and you make it applicable to what they're facing. I couldn't have said it any better. Aside from that, other things I wanted to point out was the multimedia piece from Al Jazeera talking about the GST and also linking that to something that all of us have been experiencing, which are the extremely hot temperatures. I put this Al Jazeera piece and not anyone else because it was a great way of also infusing multimedia. And why I really appreciated this piece also was because they really showed how these extremely hot temperatures were affecting people. So it's not just you're hearing it or you're reading it, you're also seeing it. And I think that's a great way of inviting people into the conversation, empowering people to be part of these conversations. And finally, just a thought, not random at all, is that yesterday this CARICOM posted this. They said it's a 10-minute read. Their statement ahead of the GST, which was mentioned earlier on as well, which also identified 4 key headline commitments ahead of COP. And when we're thinking about stories, this is the CARICOM position. This is what a lot of our countries will align themselves to. I know for sure Ghana is aligned to this position right now. When we think about these 4 key headline commitments that they want for the GST specifically, we have to think about how can this actually happen? What needs to happen for us to achieve these commitments, or what would these commitments lead to? And I think those are really cool stories to also pursue. Talk to officials from CARICOM, talk to officials from your countries, talk to people like those from climate analytics who are able to provide that sort of expert take on achieving all these sorts of things. So these are just a few of the thoughts I had about the GSC, obviously open for questions, and I have some time.
Ishani, Zan, I'm sure that you're echoing my sentiments. I am like, wow, Ishani, you're a rock star. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I just want to ask a very quick question. Again, your insights were brilliant on the global stocktake. You personally, what would you like to see happen after the global stocktake concludes? What would you like to see happen in the region, and how can you as a journalist kind of drive that motion forward?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. I think people who know me know a huge part of focus for me is I'm coming from a space where climate change journalism is not sexy. It's something that you won't readily get people to read unless you find ways of making it really applicable to them. So one thing I do is I try to link it to flooding, because that's one of the very real apparent disasters here that we face here in Ghana. For me in the region, following the GST at COP28, and this also involves me, I'm a journalist. I really want to see a concerted effort of people just trying to do more to help ordinary people understand what this is and why this is important. I don't feel in any way, shape, or form enough people are doing enough of this. I recognize climate analytics has been doing some stuff. Climate Tracker has been doing some stuff. Reporters like Kalain and my colleagues here, I saw Kalisha somewhere earlier. We're trying to do stuff, but I don't believe that we're doing enough to help people understand and appreciate the issue of the GST, of climate change discussions in general. And I mean, I don't blame anyone for it. I guess this is a learning curve and we're all just trying to learn. But I think this is also a point for us to pick up on that, do a bit more.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vashani. Dazan, if you don't have any questions?
No questions. All good. Thank you, Vashani.
Thank you so
Bianca,
much.
you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, and I just want to thank you so much, all of our speakers. You were absolutely brilliant. Apologies, Ruana actually had to drop off for another very, very important meeting. But Kalaine, can I see you for a second, please? Were you able to turn on your camera? Hello, Kalaine. So just on behalf of Ruana and Climate Analytics Caribbean, we really also wanted to thank you for your work this year as a GST ambassador. And we just have a small token of our appreciation. We would like to give you a small grant of $1,000 to help you with your travels at COP28 and to continue your fantastic reporting. So thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Dizan, back to you.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing, Kalaine. I see you took off your video, but I don't know if you want to say like, I'd like to thank my mom or something. But any words you want to add, Kalaine?
It's clearly overwhelmed with emotion.
Yeah, so much that we're now seeing an Intel screen. Okay, all right. I'll take it as that means that he's super happy about this information. So I want to say thank you so much to all our speakers today, Kalaine, Ruana, and Vishani. Thank you so much to Caribbean Climate Analytics for partnering with us on this important event where we can really share about the GST, the importance of it, and really how journalists can approach reporting at COP from a Caribbean perspective, because as we would all agree, the Caribbean perspective is not exactly what we see in mainstream media, and we really are here to change that. So before you leave, I'd like for those of you who are able to put on your video to do so that we can take a little screenshot, if possible, for the socials. For people like Bianca and I, that's actually super important and actually goes a long way. So, so please feel free to put on your video. And we have quite a lot of people here. So I'm gonna give it a couple seconds for you to put on your video, if you can. Right, I'm seeing some video coming on. And I'm gonna take all right, so in 2 seconds, you can just give me a little smile, all right? So on the count of 2, 1, 2, smile. All right, thank you. I won't take up too much of your time there again. And I really want to say again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Time really flew. Sadly, we must end it here. And a gentle reminder that you can join the Climate Tracker Network by liking and following us on social media, signing up for our newsletter. We are doing quite a lot in the Caribbean right now, and I hope you're getting excited to read the stories from our COP Caribbean fellows. There are 6 of them, and we're really excited to share their stories. We already have some pre-COP stories being published, and then we'll have a really nice couple of stories coming out during COP and then post-COP. So stay tuned, climatetracker.org. We're all over the social media to stay in touch with our fellows, not just from the Caribbean, but we also have from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So quite a nice group that's going to be reporting and sharing stories from the global South. So thank you once again for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Suzanne. Take care, everyone. See you at COP.